Hello there, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the DPS guide. My name is Tuskeh, and in this video we will be discussing how you can increase your damage. This guide is designed for everyone, regardless of your class, spec, or skill level. These tips should help you improve your damage. The first few pieces of advice might seem simple to you, but we'll gradually ramp up the complexity of these tips as we go through the video. Hopefully, they'll be useful. Now let's get started. Number 1, learn your rotation. Your rotation of spells is the foundation upon which you will build your skill, and a solid knowledge of how to cast your spells will be a great start. The first thing you should consider doing is looking up a guide for your class. You can find links to such guides in the description. Take time to read them, make notes about what your rotation is, and start practicing. Every class has a basic rotation of spells that isn't too complex. And then, things like procs, resource management, and cooldowns make it more complicated. Find a training dummy and start hitting it. Practice until you're comfortable with your basic rotation. Then, move to fighting level 100 enemies, which will actually fight back. Then, try some 5-mans out using the Dungeon Finder, and use the time to consider how your rotation changes depending upon how many enemies you're fighting. Remember that practice makes perfect. Some of the best players can do their rotations without even thinking, as it's just part of their muscle memory. Try to get to that level by practicing over and over and over again. I can't offer advice for every single class and spec, so make sure that you read up on your class and research how to do your rotation. Learning like this is very important, and building the foundation of your skill by researching your class, rather than just winging it, will make you a much stronger player in the long run. Number 2, have information easily available. As a damage dealer, your rotation will likely include buffs, debuffs, procs, and cooldowns. These are things that are vital to your success. For instance, an elemental shaman has to keep an eye on the duration of his flame shock on his enemies. He has to keep an eye out for 18 or more stacks of his lightning shield buff. He has to watch out for lava surge procs, and he has to watch for the cooldown and duration of his ascendants. These pieces of information are vital to a DPSer, and someone who can easily see important information, such as their resources like holy power, soul shards, combo points, energy, rage, runes, runic power, chi, will do much better than someone who can't easily access that information. The best way to get this information then is to use add-ons. My absolute 100% recommendation for this is WeakAuras. This is a complicated add-on, yes, but it exists to present information to you. And I have a WeakAuras guide on my channel that I'll link to in the description and on screen now. You can click the video to go there. Don't worry, clicking on it on screen won't close this video, it will just open in a new tab. You can also find a download link to WeakAuras in the description. So let's say you're using WeakAuras or some kind of other add-on to help you track information. What kind of information should you track? What kind of processes should you go through in order to make your important information available? Well, let's go through that now. First of all, you have to identify what information you need to keep track of. Consider your class guide and your rotation. What spells do you need to keep an eye on, so that you can cast them as soon as possible? What debuffs do you place on enemies, and which ones do you need to track so that you can reapply them at the right time? What buffs do you generate for yourself, and how do you use them? What cooldowns are the most important, and how do you use them as well? Do they change your rotation? Make notes about what information you need to know for your spec. Take the elemental shaman, for instance. The information I need to know, the very basic information, is: what is the duration of my flame shock on my target? What are the cooldowns of my flame shock, unleashed life, lava burst, and wind shear? How long is my ascendance going to last once I use it? How long is my fire totem's duration? Once you've identified what information you need to track, consider how best to track it. Using WeakAuras, you can create icons or timer bars for almost anything. Let's take the problem of tracking my duration of my flame shock. I open up WeakAuras, create a new icon, go to the Trigger tab, set the name to Flame Shock, the unit to Target, and check Own Only. Then, I go to the Display tab, change the text to %P, which will make it track the progress. I check Automatic Icon, and then I click and drag the icon where I want it on my screen. The most important part of displaying information is displaying it effectively. Blizzard's default user interface does an okay job of this, but it has some severe flaws. For instance, the default user interface would track my flame shock on my target's debuff list, next to its unit frame. This can easily get lost in dozens of other debuffs applied by other players, making it really difficult to locate it at a glance. Similarly, my Ascendance duration would appear in the top right of my screen, making it difficult to look at quickly. Both of these are really important. I need a better way of presenting that information to me. By making these WeakAuras, or by using an add-on that lets you customize the position of your action bars, unit frames, buffs and debuffs, and other aspects of your interface, you can reposition those important pieces of information to be here, around the center of your screen. When looking at the game, it's important that your eyes be on the center, near your character, so you can see what's going on around you. Putting information around the center so that it's easy to see while at the same time being unobtrusive is a tricky balancing act, but generally, making things as simple as possible will help. Try to avoid massive icons, and try to avoid a lot of fancy animations. Take my user interface, for example. Near the center of my screen are dozens of WeakAuras, my cast bar, my unit frame, and all of my action bars, including one larger action bar near the center that shows my most important spells. By presenting important information to you in the center of your screen, you can more readily access it, and by accessing the information faster, you can react to it faster, and even start to preempt it. This means that when your rotation changes because of, say, a debuff that needs to be refreshed, you get a proc, or a cooldown is ready, you can jump on top of it really fast, which will increase your overall damage. Number 3. Be adaptable. Every fight in the World of Warcraft is different, either in a subtle or in a gigantic way. Some fights might have you standing still, others might see you moving every minute or so. Some may see you moving every few seconds. Some may be single target, some may have adds that need to be single targeted. Some may have adds that need to be AoE'd. Some may be council fights that involve multiple bosses. Some may involve jumping into vehicles, absorbing spells, spreading out, stacking up, and each fight will ask you to do something different as a DPSer. Warlords of Draenor raids have really upped the need for individual awareness and responsibility. It is therefore crucially important that you are as adaptable as you can be. This process starts with knowing your rotation in its entirety. The number one thing to consider is that if you're in the middle of a fight and you're thinking, okay, what spell do I need to cast next? Then you haven't spent enough time learning your rotation. It needs to be muscle memory, and you need to be able to do it without thinking. Because really, these fights can be very intense. You need to be thinking about how to handle them, not your own class. After you've made your rotation muscle memory, you can consider how to start adapting to different fights. Now, this process involves a lot of thinking ahead. The first thing you should do is learn what's going to happen. Research the fight. Look up guides. I would thoroughly suggest the FatbossTV YouTube channel, which posts guides for raid bosses to a consistently high quality. They should tell you everything you need to know when it comes to the major aspects of a fight. This leads into the next part of this process, adapting to the small parts of a fight. Every single encounter will have you doing small things to avoid death, and normally you'll learn these by actually experiencing the fight. Ordinarily, these little things involve moving out of stuff on the ground. Examples include Gruul's Cave-In, Orgorge's Blackrock Pools, Beastlord Darmak's Spears, Operator Thogar's Grenades, Flamebender Kagraz's Fire Lines, and Kromog's Rune of Crushing Earth. These are little things that require a little bit of concentration from you, and they almost always involve moving. It is therefore important that you know how much you need to move, because moving is pretty much always a loss of DPS. But you can't stand still, otherwise you're most likely going to die, which is even worse for your DPS. So you have to mitigate movement as much as you can. We'll discuss techniques for this shortly, but consider how your spells and their cooldowns mesh together with the encounter. On some fights you may find no kind of synergy and you may start struggling, but on others you may find that some mechanics synergize perfectly with your rotation. An example of this is the Iron Maidens. As someone who is assigned to remain on the lower level of the fight throughout its entirety, I must do as much damage as I can during the bomb phase, where one boss has run off and the area is constantly bombarded with explosives and movement is very regular. This happens once every 3 minutes, meaning that my Ascendance, which also has a 3-minute cooldown, can be used every single time. Additionally, by combining Ascendance with my Spirit Walker's Grace, which allows me to cast while moving, I can do very heavy damage to one of the Maidens while avoiding all of their bombs. This changes my rotation from prioritizing Earthquake, which is what I do when there are 3 Maidens in the area. However, because one of them has jumped up onto the ship, there are only 2, and my area of effect rotation will not be nearly as effective. As such, using Ascendant and Spirit Walker's Grace now, instead of during a period where all 3 are active, nets me more damage than if I'd used my cooldowns arbitrarily. Thinking ahead and using your spells smartly will increase your damage. Speaking of cooldowns, while it's great to use them whenever you can, consider adapting to the fight and using them in a few different ways. First, try to overlap them. Cooldowns almost always work best when used together, and using your damage cooldown at the same time as a Bloodlust or a Heroism, or when a potion has been drunk, or when your trinkets have activated, will net you more damage than if you activated them by themselves. This is why using all of your cooldowns as soon as a fight begins is really, really effective. Also consider that if there are any parts of the fight where bosses take additional damage, such as Korag in High Maul when he's recharging his shield, you're going to want to use your cooldowns at that point. These moments of weakness are great for using cooldowns. If there is no such part of a fight, and there are no parts of a fight where damage is really, really needed, which to be fair is not a lot of bosses because a lot of them have kind of an enrage mechanic when they get low, you should consider just using your cooldowns as much as you can. A 3-minute cooldown should be used at least twice on a fight. Try to find how your cooldowns synergize and when you can use them at the same time, but try not to leave them just standing there doing nothing for too long. This really changes on a fight-per-fight basis. So, you've studied the fight ahead of time, you've used your experience to adapt to the little things, you've done your best to synergize your rotation to the fight, and you've considered when to best use your cooldowns. As you go through this process and you learn how to make the most out of each fight, remember that some classes do better on some fights than others. Don't be put off as you're learning. Do your best to adapt to the encounter's mechanics as best as you can, and always try to be doing something during a fight. Never just be standing still and doing nothing. Number 4. Mitigate movement. We briefly mentioned this previously, but it bears repeating and it is vitally important. Mitigate your movement as much as you can. By this, I'm referring to the fact that moving almost always reduces your damage, because you're moving rather than actually casting spells, and even if you're doing both, say you're in melee, it can be difficult to multitask and move correctly while also performing at your maximum strength. As such, you want to be moving as little as possible while avoiding all of the avoidable stuff. There are a few things you can do to achieve this. First of all, use movement speed increases whenever you need to move any kind of significant distance, as in more than a single global cooldown. If your global cooldown doesn't expire by the time you reach the area you're trying to reach, you don't really need a movement speed cooldown. However, if you're moving a significant distance, movement speed is great. As an elemental shaman, my Unleash Flame increases my movement speed for a few seconds, and using it whenever I need to move means that I get to my destination just that little bit faster. Just remember, however, that you want to be using spells that do not stop you from using your other spells. For instance, if I used Ghost Wolf, I wouldn't be able to cast all of my other spells while moving, such as my instant cast spells and my totems. Instead, I'd just be moving, and that effectively means I'm not doing anything, which, as I said earlier, is very bad. Next up, try to skim the edge of enemy effects as much as you can. This takes a little bit of practice, but by placing yourself on the very edge of an enemy effect, such as fire, a cave-in, or a laser beam for instance, and moving as little as possible, you can squeeze in extra spells and move much less than if you moved far away from the danger. Remember that in most cases, although not all, if you're on the edge of something bad, you won't take any damage. Let's return to the Iron Maiden's fight during the bomb phase for our example of this. During the phase, I want to move as little as possible, and the bombs have a fairly limited area of effect that is first denoted by the targeting circle on the floor, and then without any kind of tell. But the two effects tend to have the same range. As such, when I'm avoiding the targeting circles, I move from my unsafe position to the very edge of the safe position, reducing the time it takes for me to get into safety and resume my damage. This ties into adapting to the fight. Learn the little things like where is safe to stand and where is not, and how much room you need to give certain mechanics. Learn these little things, take notes about them either literally or in your head, and then take advantage of them by moving as little as you can while remaining nice and safe. Number 5, cast as much and as effectively as possible. This one might seem fairly simple, but there are a lot of complexities to using your abilities effectively and frequently. Consider just what your role is for a second. It's to deal damage, yes. How do you deal your damage though? Primarily through your abilities. So, the more abilities you cast, the more damage you're going to deal. If you have two players playing the same class while wearing similar gear, and both of them use the same rotation and live to see the entire fight, generally, although again, not always, the player that deals more damage will be the player that casted more spells throughout the course of the fight than the other. So, how do you make sure you pump out as many spells as possible? Well, first of all, make sure that you can cast your spells effectively. This is where key binding versus clicking comes into consideration. Now, I have been an advocate of clicking if it is effective, but this only really works if you're a healer or a tank, and even then it isn't as effective as key binding. For a damage dealer though, you need to keybind your abilities. Clicking on your abilities can work, yes, and you can do well by clicking. However, in almost all cases, you can do better by keybinding. If you're struggling with your keybinds, consider taking a look at my keybinding guide, available in the description or on screen now. Again, clicking the link on screen won't close this video, it will open in a new tab. So, assuming you've keybound your spells, let's discuss the process of improving the amount of abilities you use in a fight. The first thing you should do is consider what spell is your most important one. Which one deals the most damage in which situation? For the Elemental Shaman, Lava Burst deals the most damage in a single target situation, and Earthquake deals more damage in a multiple target situation, with Earthquake dealing tremendous damage if I can ever use Chain Lightning on 3 or more enemies. So, Earthquake and Lava Burst are both really important for me. The more times I use them, the more damage I'm going to do. Once you've identified what spell is the most important, you need to figure out how to cast it as much as you can. This is a fairly simple process. Prioritize it over any of your other abilities so that you can keep the spell on cooldown as much as you possibly can. However, what about your other abilities? They're important as well, especially ones that you cast a lot. For the Elemental Shaman, it's Lightning Bolt. This is more for casters than for melee, but always make sure you never pause in between finishing one spell and casting another. Make yourself chain cast your spells. The key to doing this is to know what you're going to be casting next. This comes from learning your rotation and making it muscle memory. Think ahead and know what you're going to be doing before you actually do it. To actually put this into practice, you should spam your keys. This is a fairly simple process. If I'm going to cast 3 Lightning Bolts and then a Lava Burst, and my Lightning Bolt is bound to the 1 key and my Lava Burst is bound to the 2 key, then I want to be hammering my 1 key as much as I can, until I've casted 3 Lightning Bolts, like this. During the 3rd Lightning Bolt's cast, I start repeatedly pressing the Lava Burst key, until I start casting it. The reason you want to spam your keys like this is to counteract the natural latency you will incur by playing the game. There's always a delay in between pressing a spell and the servers recognizing that you've cast it, and this teeny tiny delay can add up over the course of a 10-minute fight. As such, constantly inputting the command to cast a spell, hammering the key, will help to counteract this lag. It's much faster than seeing a spell finish, then pressing another key, because this takes into consideration the lag of the server, and then your natural human reaction time. By hammering the key and spamming, you remove your reaction time from the equation altogether. Just note, it's also not a good idea to use, say, Quartz, or another castbar add-on that shows you your latency at the end of a spell cast. This is because your latency at the end of a spell can often be different than the latency at the start of it, meaning that there will be a delay in between you reacting and pressing the spell. Just hammer your keys. It will wear out your keyboard, yes, but it is 100% the fastest and most efficient way to chain cast spells. And remember, never ever be doing nothing, especially as a caster. A great DPSer will barely ever stop being active and will always be casting something. So you've made your rotation muscle memory, you've made information about your spells, resources, and their effects easily available, you've worked on becoming adaptable by learning the fights and synergizing your rotation to them, you're mitigating movement as much as you possibly can by moving faster and a smaller distance, and you're casting as many spells as possible, prioritizing the most powerful spells and keeping yourself busy at all times. Just remember, however, that the number one thing you need to do to get better as a DPSer is to want to get better. Constantly try to beat your damage passes, constantly try to improve your rotation on specific fights, and constantly do your best to help your raid succeed. The best DPSs are ones that can be competitive on the damage meters while also helping the raid, either through utility spells and cooldowns, managing enemies through crowd controls, kiting or other mechanics, and volunteering to handle certain mechanics in an encounter. Being able to do all of that while constantly striving to improve your position on the meters will make you a valuable member of your raid team. More important than anything else, however, is to enjoy yourself. You're in a game. Master it if you can, but always enjoy it. Do your best to help your raid team, constantly try to improve, and regardless of your class, you will be an asset to your group. The only thing they can ask you to do is do your best. So do your best. That concludes this video. I hope you enjoyed it and you found it helpful. If you have any thoughts, questions, suggestions, or feedback, you can contact me using the links in the description, or you can just leave a comment. If you have any questions about your DPS, I'll do my best to answer. As always, I offer my heartfelt thanks to my patrons for making videos like this possible, with thanks today going to Sebastian Dormel. Thank you very much for watching, and I wish you the best of luck in the world of Warcraft.